The maitre d' at Aveline had already checked on her twice, and still Lila Carter sat at a gleaming table for two beneath the chandelier's 1,000 crystal droplets, counting each second like a bead on a rosary. 47 minutes. 47 minutes of pretending the wine list was fascinating, of tracing the elegant fonts with a trembling finger, of peeking at her phone when it buzzed, only to realize it was just her own breath fogging the glass. 47 minutes under the soft scrutiny of every other diner who knew exactly what was happening and wished they didn't. A pianist in the corner coaxed something gentle and sad out of a baby grand. Butter sizzled from the open kitchen. Someone laughed too loudly at the bar. It all felt far away. Hope had carried her into this room. She wore it like the sapphire blue dress she'd promised herself only if tonight went the way she'd dreamed. Soft fabric that hugged her waist like a secret, a hint of sparkle at the collarbone, lipstick the color of ripe cherries she'd bought because the woman at the counter said it read romance. Her makeup was flawless, a careful application of courage she didn't feel. The flick of liner that usually made her feel invincible now dragging her eyes down with every minute that passed. She could sense the curious couple to her left stealing glances. She could tell which waiters gave her a wide pass, the kind reserved for small tragedies unfolding in public. This was supposed to be the night, the culmination of 3 years with Jared, steady, sensible, as comfortable as an old cardigan, if not nearly as warm. She'd pictured a velvet box sliding from a jacket pocket, the world narrowing to a single gleam of light, and a single impossibly beautiful question. She'd pictured her own laughter, breathless and astonished, tears threatening to ruin her mascara in the best possible way. Her phone vibrated against the linen, once, twice, and she pounced on it like a cat catching a falling leaf. It wasn't traffic. It wasn't flowers arriving late. It wasn't a surprise. Sorry, Al, I can't do this anymore. You deserve more than I can give. Don't wait for me. The words tiled across the screen, black on white, little digital knives. Her throat closed, the polished restaurant spun. She blinked hard as the message blurred and doubled. He had ended 3 years with a text while she sat where he'd asked her to be, dressed for a proposal. Her heart gift-wrapped and waiting. Her future snapped like the stem of a too-heavy rose. "Ma'am?" The waiter's voice was kind and low, as if softness could keep humiliation from spreading. It made it worse. Aveline's staff was infamous for discretion, but even discretion had eyes. It was the 3rd time he'd approached. "Will you be ordering this evening?" She managed a whisper that felt like it had to crawl over glass to escape her lips. "No, I'll be leaving." The room dimmed at the edges. The pianist dragged his pedal, and the last chord lingered like a sigh. Lila stood, clutching her small handbag like a lifeline, desperate to flee into the dark staccato of New Harbor's streets, where the city didn't care who you were or what had broken you. She'd melt into crowds and let the night swallow her whole. She'd cry in the privacy of movement, on a subway that wore strangers' sadness like perfume. But then someone stepped into the path of her escape, as if he'd stepped out of a doorway she hadn't seen. He was impossibly tall, in a charcoal suit that fit him like a second skin, every seam whispering money you never had to think about. In his hands, he held 2 flutes of champagne, bubbles rising in slow motion like tiny stars caught in amber. "Sorry I'm late, darling," he said, in a voice that could have sold out a theater, smooth, certain, a baritone with warmth coiled in its depths. It carried just enough to be heard by the tables around them. Heads turned. The sympathetic glances softened into something like curiosity. He leaned in close, and with a warm breath against her ear, he made a private world inside the crowded room. "Play along," he murmured, his eyes a striking green that belonged to deep forests and cold rivers. "You don't deserve this." Before she could catalog the 1,000 reckless choices that led a stranger to improvise a rescue, he slid into the seat across from hers, setting one flute in front of her with a grace that steadied the table, and, somehow, steadied her pulse. Their fingertips brushed. A spark zipped up her arm, something alive after an hour of dead waiting. "He's going to regret losing you," he said. He didn't say it casually. He said it like he'd seen the pages of her life and decided to underline that sentence. He caught the waiter's eye, gentle, practiced, and entirely sure of himself. "We'll have the tasting menu for two, and let's keep the champagne coming, please." He turned back to her, and a crooked smile lifted one corner of his mouth. "Let's show this room you don't need anyone to shine." Lila's body remembered how to breathe. Hope flickered, a small flame cupped in careful hands. She didn't know if she should laugh, cry, or toss the champagne into her throat and ask for another. She did none of those. She sat. And when the first course arrived, seared scallops in a lemon beurre blanc, art arranged on porcelain, she discovered she could still taste. It was like stepping into fiction. A stranger with the audacity to be kind had rewritten her scene, and now there was nothing to do but speak. The empty space between them filled up with air and light, and something like possibility. "Do you always rescue abandoned women at expensive restaurants?" she asked, finally finding her voice, albeit in a whisper that wobbled. The scallop melted on her tongue. She felt aware of everything: the candle's pooling light, the clink of crystal, the faint scent of truffle drifting from another table. His fork paused halfway to his mouth. The severe lines of his face softened into a smile so real it made her dizzy. "No," he admitted, "but there was something in your eyes. Not just sadness, defiance. It made me curious." The honesty disarmed her better than any practiced charm would have. The wall of shame that had been building brick by brick began to crumble. Conversation bloomed. He asked about her literature class at Brookview High, the way her students read Pride and Prejudice as if it were gossip, the kid in the back who insisted Mr. Darcy needed therapy. He asked about the children's book she'd been drafting for years but never finishing, about the title she kept changing like a secret she couldn't commit to. He listened without glancing at a phone, without scanning the room for anyone more interesting to impress or entertain. His attention was a steady heat, not a flash, and it made her life feel like it mattered. "I'm in the business of building things," he said when she asked him what he did, and it was purposefully vague. He was no less skilled at conversation than at ordering like a king, but he kept himself as carefully shaded as the dining room lighting. He drew her out with gentle questions until laughter came more naturally than holding back tears. The piano drifted into a brighter key. Somewhere a cork popped. She felt for the first time in a long time seen. Yet when the bill arrived, a slip of paper heavy with impossible numbers, reality reared up and knocked on her temple. "We have to split this," she said, calculating months of coffee and grocery budgets in a blink. Her teacher's salary had never felt smaller. He waved a hand as if dismissing the idea from the air itself. "Tonight is on me." The tone suggested not arrogance, but a quiet decision. Outside, the night carried a spring chill that snapped her into herself. A sleek black car idled by the curb, its engines a low purr. A uniformed driver stepped out and opened the rear door with a reverence that made her heart hiccup. "Good evening, Mr. Hart," the driver said. Hart. The name lodged in Lila's chest. She pulled out her phone. Curiosity is just the polite word for panic with a Wi-Fi connection. Her fingers flew. Damien Hart. Page after page unfurled. Hart & Company, a global conglomerate whose sleek, iron-gray logo stamped the skyline. Photos of ribbon cuttings, charity galas, magazine covers. Last week's headlines told of a multi-billion-dollar acquisition that had industry pundits breathless. He was not rich. He was a continent made of money and steel grip. He was the kind of man you read about, not the kind of man who looked at your trembling hands and steadied them with champagne and sentences that saved you. He turned back to her, his smile dimming as he read the new tension in her face. "You found out." Not a question. Something like disappointment, maybe resignation, passed through his eyes like a shadow of a cloud over water. "So what now?" he asked softly. "Do you run because I have money?" Her throat was suddenly dry. She felt like a guppy that had wandered into a shark tank, everything too vast, too glittering, closing in. Before she could assemble words, he extended his hand. His palm was open. His expression was open, too, the practiced CEO calm replaced with human hope. "Don't let the night end like this. One more hour. If you hate it, You'll never hear from me again." Her body didn't feel like her own anymore. Rational thoughts lined up with exit signs. But her heart, still bruised, now beating bravely, pushed her feet forward. She put her hand in his, and the city changed shape around them as if sighing in relief. The elevator to his penthouse hummed like a secret. It ascended with that expensive silence that made her feel somehow smaller and bigger at once. When the doors opened on a space that seemed more like a private observatory than an apartment, she almost laughed. Walls of glass revealed New Harbor spread out like a city of glitter poured into a bowl. Wind kissed her face as she stepped onto the terrace, wineglass in hand. Below, taxis stitched the streets with threads of yellow and red. Above, a plane blinked past like an echo of a star. What am I doing here? The thought was a drumbeat. She was a high school English teacher who edited student essays with a purple pen so she wouldn't bruise their confidence. He was the man whose decisions appeared in stock tickers and news crawls. He stood beside her and somehow managed to make the space between them respectful. He didn't crowd her with his presence, he didn't force the view. He watched her take it in and then watched her instead. "It's a great view," he said at last, voice low enough that the glass didn't need to try too hard to keep their words in. "It gets quiet up here." She turned to him. "Is this what you do? Bring women you rescue to your giant empty apartment with the world at your feet?" A wince flickered across his features. Small, real. "No." He swallowed, and the man with the magazine covers left him like a coat on a chair. "I don't bring anyone here." He hesitated, then let the story out as if every word cost something. He built Hart & Company from nothing after his parents died. He was 20. Grief and acid that ate him from the inside. And building became his only way to keep the pain from taking everything. The bigger the company grew, the less people looked at him and saw a man. He became a solution to someone's problem, an answer to a question he hated. "You looked at me tonight, even after you knew who I was." He shook his head, eyes on the city's pulse. "You asked, who am I? Not what can he do?" Vulnerability pulled at the knots in Lila's chest. Words she rarely said to anyone began to slip in a quiet stream. She told him how, with Jared, her dreams had been dismissed as quaint, how her voice had been sanded down to fit the shape of his plans, how sometimes she felt like a post-it note in other people's stories. For a while they weren't a billionaire and a teacher, they were what everyone is when the world stops watching. Two lonely souls on a terrace under a sky the color of spilled ink, sharing their scars. The distance closed. His hand lifted. He tucked a strand of hair behind her ear with a touch so careful it made her gasp. A line of electricity stitching a seam down her spine. He leaned in. She felt every inch of air between them get charged. This was the kind of moment people cheapen with words like fate. She didn't want a word. She wanted his breath on her mouth. His phone shattered the spell, sharp, insistent, a ringtone that belonged to crises, not kisses. He tensed, his jaw hardening. He glanced, and the CEO returned to his body like armor fitting over muscle. "I have to take this." She nodded. The intimate bubble popped, and the rush of the rest of the world flooded back, loud and unwelcome. When he hung up and turned to her, the apology on his face hurt worse than the sound. "I should go," she said quickly. If she stayed, she was certain she'd say something like, "I'll wait," and she couldn't be the woman who waited in a penthouse she didn't belong in. "Wait," he started, that same plea back in his voice, but she was already moving. "It's okay," she added with a smile that felt stapled on. "Reality, it's calling you, and, honestly, me." He followed her to the elevator as if worried she might dissolve. At the door, he reached out and wrapped careful fingers around her wrist. The heat of his touch sent a message straight to her ribcage. "Can I see you again?" The urgency in his voice scared her and soothed her all at once. "Tomorrow?" Everything rational tried to make her say no. Too much, too fast. But his eyes held hope and fear like a mirror held sky and water, and she couldn't refuse that mix. "Maybe," she whispered. The doors closed, her reflection doubled, then vanished. As the elevator decanted her onto ordinary ground again, a new panic rose in her body. He hadn't asked for her number. He was a man who closed deals and scheduled jets with a text and a nod. How on earth did he forget the most basic thing? She woke to her phone drilling into the nightstand. For a ridiculous, cinematic half-breath, she thought, Damien. Her thumb said yes before her brain could say don't. The screen filled with 47 unread messages. Not from him, from the past. I made a mistake. Lila, please. I can't sleep. I can't think. I'm sorry. I saw pictures. Who is that guy? Jared's frantic digital confession came in waves. He sounded less like a lover, and more like a man who'd dropped something precious and wanted to blame the floor. Anger warmed her fingers. Irritation prickled her skin. The sorrow she'd expected didn't come. The space where it should have lived felt hollow and clean, like a room that had been aired out. One night with Damien Hart had done more to erase Jared's handprint from her heart than 3 years of careful compromise had done to put it there. Brookview High smelled like dry erase markers and muddy hallway sneakers. Lila floated through the day like a dream someone had switched on the wrong channel. At lunch, her friend Nina ambushed her in the faculty lounge, the screen of her phone thrust under Lila's nose. "Spill it, Carter," Nina demanded with a grin that made teenagers confess to lies they hadn't even told yet. "Who's Mr. Tall, Dark, and Quantum stock price? He looks like he lives in a tux." Lila tried to swat it away. It was nothing. It was weird. She had been saved from herself. The corners of her mouth kept betraying her, lifting into a secret smile whenever her mind replayed his voice saying, "I don't bring anyone here." During her free period, she returned to her classroom to find a black envelope lying like a shadow on her desk. Her name was written in an elegant, masculine hand that turned the L into a flourish. Her heart beat against the bones of her chest as if trying to break free. Inside, 2 VIP tickets to the city's most buzzed-about modern art exhibition at Morrow Contemporary. The one she'd told him she'd dreamt of visiting since before it opened. Tucked with them was a card, thick as a promise. For the woman who makes the world feel colorful again. -D. He'd found her. Not through her phone, through the city. The gesture was so precisely tuned to their conversation that it made her breath snag. She was supposed to meet Nina for wine and complaints that night. Instead, she slid into a dress that made her feel like a clever art critic and walked through Morrow's gleaming doors in a nervous lilt that felt like walking and almost running at once. She told herself she was here for Rothko, for sculpture, for the installation everyone said was as immersive as weather. Her eyes betrayed her and scanned the crowd for green eyes and deliberate hands. She saw him, and then she saw she wasn't the only one who had. A woman with a razor-sharp bob and a dress that looked stitched by mathematicians clung to his arm with an intimacy that knocked the wind out of Lila. The woman's laugh fell on him like a possession. So this is how the story goes. A voice laughed inside her head, meaner than any critic. You are a charity case with good bone structure. Humiliation washed Lila cold. She pivoted, a gasp already gathering in her chest. But the room wasn't as big as she needed it to be. His eyes found hers anyway, and whatever was on his face was not the smile you gave just anyone. It was joy, clear and bright. He excused himself from the woman with a courtesy that looked like apology, and moved toward Lila with the kind of purpose security guards watch for. "Lila," he said, "you came." His smile made the air warmer. "I didn't realize you were with someone." It came out brittle despite her best efforts. The woman watched from a distance with a cool, appraising gaze, as if she were negotiating for a painting. He opened his mouth to explain, but a hand clamped onto Lila's arm, fingers digging into soft skin hard enough to bruise. "We're talking now," Jared snapped. He'd materialized from the white-walled crowd like an omen, righteous anger pasted over something uglier. Lila stumbled, and the air around them changed temperature. Damien crossed the space like a shadow and took position between Jared and Lila, his eyes darkening to a stormy green that told every muscle in Jared's body to step back. "Take your hand off her," Damien said, low and without any tremor, the voice you use to move mountains. He didn't raise it. He didn't need to. Morrow went still. Even the installation shifted like it was paying attention. "I've known her for 3 years, Jared snarled, trying for the last remaining ground he thought he owned. In one night, Damien said, taking another step forward, I learned what you never bothered to see. People do flock to chaos. A hum of gossip rose like bees. Lila felt the old choking shame rise, and then something else cut through it. Anger snapped in her like a twig catching flame. She wrenched her arm free. Jared's surprised hey died under the glare she threw him. You're right, she said, voice shaky and fierce all at once. You've known me for 3 years, the gallery's acoustics carried her words. 3 years of canceled plans for more important people. 3 years of you calling my love of books cute and my dreams sweet little hobbies. 3 years of being too much when I needed you and never enough when you wanted something. You didn't leave me at that restaurant, Jared. You set me free. He stood blinking, mouth parting, excuses lined up like cabs that suddenly realized there were no passengers. She turned and walked away, head high, the soles of her shoes clicking out a rhythm that felt like liberation. Damien followed at a respectful distance, not touching her, but there, always there. Outside, New Harbor's night felt like a balm. She was trembling, but it wasn't fear. It was adrenaline, relief, the body's strange hymn after danger. Are you okay? Damien asked, voice gentle again, that dangerous edge he'd honed to protect her now tucked away. I am, she laughed, breathless. I'm better than okay. I should explain, he said quickly, about her, about Celeste. The woman with the knife bob and a gaze like a laser. She's my vice president of operations. That was a business event, he paused, then continued with honesty that sounded like it was scraping him raw. She has made it clear she wants more. I do not. Why are you explaining any of this? Lila asked and immediately hated the defensiveness in her tone. We barely know each other. Because you're worth explaining it to. He took her hands in both of his. His palms were warm, steady. Because I don't want you to think for a second that last night wasn't real. She felt her guard melt in a rush that was almost dizzying. Okay, she said. Then let's go on a date. A real one. His smile was blinding. Name the time and place. Aveline is booked for you for the next month. No more limos. No 5-star anything, please. She gave his hands a small squeeze, a plea wrapped in humor. I want to get to know you, not your driver. For the first time, something like fear flickered in his eyes. I'm not sure I know how to do that, he confessed. It's been a long time since my life was ordinary. Then we'll figure it out together. Neither of them noticed the glossy black sedan parked just off the curb. Inside, Celeste Vaughn watched through tinted glass, phone pressed to her ear, a smile that didn't touch her eyes stitched across her mouth. He's more invested than I thought, she murmured into the phone. We may need to move faster. When Damien arrived at Lila's apartment that Saturday, she barely recognized him. Gone were the bespoke suits and cufflinks that had looked like small pieces of art. He wore jeans and a dark gray t-shirt that made him look younger, more human, his hair whipped by the wind into something boyish. He drove himself in a sleek, understated car that announced money only to people who already knew the language of engines. He held nothing but his keys and a grin that made her knees a little unreliable. Your order, ma'am, he said, mock formal. One normal date. It was ordinary, and therefore extraordinary. They wandered through a street fair that smelled like grilled onions and cinnamon sugar, vendors barking in sing-song to lure you to miracle cleaners and handcrafted jewelry that caught the late afternoon sun. Damien ate a hot dog with a seriousness that was almost reverent and got mustard on his chin like the world's most endearing cliché. Lila wiped it away with a napkin, and he looked at her like that touch had rearranged the furniture in his chest. They stopped to listen to a violin busker who played a song so sweet and aching that Lila pressed $1 into the case with shaking fingers. Damien tossed in a bill that made the violinist's eyes widen. At a rigged ring toss, Damien focused like the game was a boardroom contract and won her a goldfish in a plastic bag. We'll name him Plot Twist, he decided, because frankly, their next stop was Paradise Books, a sprawling secondhand bookstore where dust motes danced like glitter and narrow aisles turned into secret passageways. Lila moved through the stacks like a pilgrim, trailing fingers over spines, lifting books to her nose to breathe in paper and time. She read lines out loud in a hushed voice, giving each word the weight it deserved. Damien followed, not impatient, not fidgeting, just watching like the act of loving sentences was the sexiest thing he'd ever seen. At the counter, he handed over a tower of books so tall the clerk had to lean to see around it. "Damien, no!" Lila protested, laughing and horrified. "That's not normal." "That's a small library. This is normal." He took the bags. A playful glint slipped into his eye. "Boyfriends buy their girlfriends presents." The words seemed to hang in the bookstore's soft light like dust, visible and everywhere. They landed between them. Lila's heart somersaulted. He realized what he'd said a second after she did. Crimson nicked the edge of his jawline. Sorry, presumptuous. What I meant was..." She kissed him. It was not a desperate kiss, or the kiss that follows near-death experiences in movies. It was sweet and sure and quick enough to feel like a secret, an answer, delivered with her mouth. That evening, he let her choose dinner. She picked Nonna Rosa, a tiny Italian place in her neighborhood with checkered tablecloths, candles stuffed into old Chianti bottles, a framed photograph of Sophia Loren on the wall. The pasta had been the same since 1978. The conversations at the other tables felt like they'd been going on just as long. They laughed over a shared dish and too much garlic bread, until an older man with flour on his apron bustled over. "Damien?" he asked, eyes widening. "Madonna, how long has it been?" "Not since..." He stopped, his cheer shadowed by something old. "Not since you were just a boy coming in with your parents." Before the accident, the air went thin. Damien's posture shifted like someone had taken a string and pulled it straight through his spine. Enzo, owner, chef, witness to 1,000 first dates and proposals, mumbled an apology and retreated. Lila waited, her hand near his but not yet touching, offering him a quiet that felt like invitation instead of demand. He stared past her toward the kitchen door, the way people look at places where ghosts sometimes stand. "My parents died in a factory fire when I was 20, he said, voice low and stripped of anything but pain. A fire that shouldn't have happened. Someone shaved dollars off safety to pad a quarters numbers. He finally looked at her. The wound in his eyes was not healed. It was clean, and it had scarred, but there was still pain under the scar. I built my company to be the opposite of that. People first, always. He exhaled a breath that trembled. I wanted to spend my life building the thing that would have saved them. That's why you work the way you do." The understanding unfurled in Lila with a warmth that made her chest ache. It was never about the money. Her voice softened to something like reverence. "It's not an obsession. It's a mission." He seemed startled, then moved. Offense leaves, relief arrives. He hadn't expected naming to feel like healing. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, squeezing as if to say thank you without making both of them cry. Her phone buzzed violently on the wood, making the candles tremble. "Mom." She answered, and her mother's voice crashed over her like surf, frantic, weeping. "Lila, thank God. He was here. Jared was here. He told me you're with some rich predator. He had articles, horrible things about Damien Hart. Lila, these tabloids, people are saying, 'Oh, sweetheart, what have you gotten yourself into?'" Damien went utterly still. The rawness from minutes ago was replaced by something haunted, defensive, like a man bracing for a punch he'd learned to expect. The warm air of the restaurant turned cold. "Is any of that true?" Lila asked when she'd hung up, and she asked it without accusation. She asked it like a plea, "Save this." He didn't look away. Somehow that was worse. What exactly did they say? He asked, weary and tight, and when the check landed, he paid it with the efficiency of a man who knew every type of exit. The ride to her apartment stretched and thinned with the weight of what they didn't say. In her living room, plants in mismatched pots, a throw blanket from a thrift store he said he liked because it was the color of summer. He pulled out his phone. He typed his name, and the screen bloomed with him in suits beside women with famous faces. Headlines screaming billionaire bachelor, conquests, broken hearts like it was a list they had to use up. "After my first billion, they made a character," he said flatly. "Every meeting with a woman became a scandal. Every charity dinner, a secret romance. It sold papers. It clicked links. He looked up and there was something begging in his eyes, like a man who had given the judge everything he had and was waiting for the gavel anyway. In 5 years, I've had 2 serious relationships. They both ended the same way, he added with a laugh so humorless it hurt. They fell in love with Damien Hart, the concept. Not the man who eats hot dogs and gets mustard on his face. She believed him. It wasn't logic, it was gut. It was the way he looked when he admitted the thing about his parents. It was the kindness in his jawline when he'd told her she didn't deserve this. "I need time," she said quietly, "not as punishment, but as care, to separate the man from the myth. I need to talk to my family." He nodded, but panic flashed through his eyes like a coded flare. He knew what came next. He'd stood on enough doorsteps and watched enough women walk back inside their lives. "Don't let them," he gestured to the phone like it had a face. "Decide how you feel about me, Lila. Please." He left, and the silence that settled in her apartment felt like weather. Her phone rang from an unknown number later that night. "Lila, it's Celeste." The voice was polished, soothing like a commercial for a luxury SUV. "I know we didn't get off on the right foot, but as a woman, I have to warn you. Damien is married to his company. He will promise you a world he cannot inhabit. I've seen it. I just don't want you to be another casualty." Lila stared at her phone after she hung up, a knot forming in her stomach that tightened with every breath. The words were poison disguised as concern, and they slid into the very places Damien had confessed to her. She waited 3 days. During those 3 days, Damien sent a single text each morning. "Thinking of you. I'm here when you're ready." On the 3rd day, her readiness crystallized into certainty. She reached for her phone to tell him. A news alert flashed. Celeste Vaughn promoted to COO of Hart & Company in surprise move. Below it, a photo. Damien and Celeste standing shoulder to shoulder in a wash of flashbulbs. The comments had already turned them into a power couple, the internet's favorite movie. Jealousy shot through Lila, hot, bright, immediate, surprising her with its strength. She went very still as the truth arrived. She was in love with him, not in the soft way she had loved Jared, pleasantly, safely, in the way you might love a sweater you knew wouldn't fall apart in the wash. This was hurricane edge, cliff edge, the way a bird must feel when it realizes the air will hold. Love didn't bring peace. It brought panic, because now there was something to lose. She was in the middle of a lively lecture on Pride and Prejudice, Lydia Bennet's recklessness, Mr. Darcy's prejudice, Elizabeth's quick tongue, when the classroom door creaked open. 30 teenagers turned as one. Damien Hart stood in the doorway of Brookview High, as if he had taken a wrong turn at boardroom and ended up in homeroom. He held a bouquet of sunflowers so wide and cheerful, it made the gray day through the window seem like an error. He looked only at Lila, fear and determination braided together in his face. "I'm sorry to interrupt," he said, his voice strangely shy. "But I couldn't wait any longer." Gasping and giggles cracked across the room. Phones slid onto desks with screens angled for maximum capture. Lila felt heat rush to her face as he walked toward her, every step a public confession. "You asked me to be real," he said, voice low enough to pretend this was private, loud enough for everyone to hear anyway. "So here I am. I am terrible at this. I work too much. I carry more baggage than an airport carousel, and I'm terrified of how I feel about you." He laughed lightly at himself. "But you make me want to be better. You make me feel like I can be me, not a headline, not a myth." Tears burned the corners of her eyes. "You have to talk to him after class, Ms. C," one of her bolder students stage whispered. The class rippled with laughter and a kind of joy Lila would replay for years. "We need to talk," she told him, taking the sunflowers and finding the center of gravity in her hand again. "For real." They went to a small cafe down the street after the final bell, the bell's ring still buzzing in her bones. She traced the rim of her coffee cup and let out the fear that had been chewing at her. "Our worlds are so different, Damien. You run an empire. I find $20 bills in old coats and feel wealthy." What if I'm not enough for your world? He reached for her hand, covering it easily. What if my world isn't enough for you? He countered softly. You stand in front of a room full of human storms and you teach them how to read themselves. You believe in stories. You make a difference. Before you, my life was meetings and numbers. You made me want to eat street food and read Neruda on a Tuesday. Her defenses collapsed, not under pressure, but under kindness. They decided, simple and difficult, to try. No more hedging, no more maybe. They walked out hand in hand, and the future looked like clean paper. They almost walked into Jared. He had a girl with him who looked like a younger Lila if someone had doubted her every day. Jared's eyes raced to their interlaced fingers and then to Damien's face. Looks like we've both moved on, he said, aiming for nonchalant, landing on brittle. But when he looked at Lila, there was an ocean of regret. Damien offered a curt nod that was neither cruel nor kind and guided Lila away. That night, as Lila brushed her teeth and smiled at her own ridiculous hope in the mirror, her email pinged itself into her bones. No sender. Subject line, proof. The photos were grainy, taken with a long lens that sat far away and guessed at intimacy. Damien and Celeste at a hotel bar, heads close, laughing. Damien and Celeste stepping into an elevator late at night. The camera made a story out of angles. A single line of text slithered under the images. He will never change. Save yourself while you still can. The white light of the phone screen turned the room into a sterile, cold place. Damien slept beside her, breath deep, body heavy with trust that he was safe here. The night had felt like a soft confirmation of everything they were becoming. Now it was a series of sharp breaths. She accidentally dropped the phone, the clatter loud enough to startle the room and the man in it. "Leela?" he mumbled, voice thick with sleep. "Everything okay?" He blinked at the brightness, at the tears filling her eyes, at the look of hurt she couldn't stuff down. He sat up, awake in a heartbeat. "What is it?" She didn't speak. She handed him the phone. He looked, and his reaction was a physical thing. His jaw tightened until his cheek hollowed, anger turning his gaze to flint. "This is a manipulation," he said, voice low and leashed. He swiped, and with each image, his fury sharpened. He looked at her, pleading in the space between his eyebrows. "This is a lie." He didn't wait for questions. He explained in clipped sentences that tried to be gentle. The hotel bar was in Chicago during a tech conference. His entire executive team sat just out of frame. The elevator led to a rooftop restaurant where they'd met investors, also out of frame. "She's always tactile," he added in a sigh that sounded exhausted. "It means nothing." Lila wanted to believe him so badly, her bones ached with it. But doubt is a seed planted by the precise people who know exactly which soil inside you will grow it. "Why would someone do this?" she whispered. "Who hates us that much?" He went very still. Then cold certainty settled like steel in his spine. "It's not hate. It's separation. And I have a good idea who's behind it." The next morning, he didn't call Celeste. He asked Lila to come with him to Celeste's office. "No more shadows. We do this together," he said. Celeste was packing her desk when they walked in, composure wrapped around her like her last good dress. "I thought I might see you," she said, looking not at Damien but at Lila, as if they were two women in a mirror deciding who was the real one. "The emails," Damien said. "The photos." "Stop." She denied it with that same polished concern, her lies smooth as glass. But under the pressure of his gaze, her composure cracked. The fury that burst through looked less like a villain and more like a woman told a story she'd written didn't matter. "You're throwing everything away for a high school teacher you've known for 5 minutes, she snapped. "She doesn't know our world. She'll make you weak." "Our world," he echoed with a quiet that made the hairs on Lila's arms lift. "No, my world. And Lila is the most important part of it now." The finality in his tone slammed doors inside the room that would never open again. Celeste's mouth trembled with fury and heartbreak. She yanked a letter from a drawer and threw it on the desk. "Fine." She shot Lila a look that was equal parts pity and warning. "When he hurts you, and he will, Remember I told you. She left a trail of perfume and ambition in her wake. Lila felt a surprising flicker of pity for a woman who mistook proximity for belonging. Relief flooded in behind it. The threat, the one they could name, at least, was gone. They walked out of Hart & Company's glass tower into sunlight. Lila's phone rang. "Lila!" The principal's voice sounded like someone who had picked up a snake by mistake. "There's a man here to see you. He says he's your father." The words hit like a physical thing. Thomas Carter was less a person in Lila's life than a shadow that sometimes turned up at the edges of memories. Damien saw her go stiff, saw her face suck color like a tide. "He's at my school," she whispered, astonished at the taste of that sentence. "My father." She found him in the principal's office where she'd told a dozen teens they weren't actually in trouble. He looked smaller than the ghost she'd carried, thinner hair, a new stoop, but the eyes had that old calculating gleam that made her skin crawl. "You've got some nerve," she said, voice low and shaking, "walking in here after 20 years. "I know I'm in your debt, Lila." He began with a rasp that tried to wear remorse. "Debt?" She barked a laugh. "You don't have a debt. You left a void. You abandoned me. No number fills that." He cycled through scripts she'd both expected and dreaded. He'd been sick. He'd been lost. He thought of her every day. Each excuse was so transparent she could see the hunger through it. For one small, painful second, the little girl who'd watched front doors and counted cars wanted to believe. Then he played his hand. "I saw you in the news," he said, shifting like a man trying to get comfortable in a lie. "I hear your boyfriend is a billionaire. Must be nice having someone who can take care of you and your family." There it was, the motive wearing her last name. The nausea rose fast. "Get out," she said, flat as stone. He tried the coaxing tone. She cut him off with the voice she used to restore order to classrooms. "Get out." He stood thwarted, and as he reached the door he pivoted with a last-ditch flare of patriarchal threat. "You'll regret this. I'm still your father. I have rights." At the penthouse, she poured the story into Damien's chest and watched his face harden into something protective and dangerous. "I'll handle it," he said, already reaching for his phone. "My lawyers will get a restraining order so fast." "No." The word was quiet, but put the phone down like a slammed fist would have. He looked confused. "No," she repeated, stronger now. She stood and wiped her face and felt a line of steel slot into place in her spine. "My whole life, men have either tried to save me or break me. Jared made me small. You saved me from that public shame. My father wants to use me, and you want to protect me, and I—" Her eyes met his. "I need to do this myself. I need to prove to myself that I can stand without waiting for a rescue." His instincts fought him. They were written into the way he reached for problems. He saw something in her that looked like sunlight through glass, and he forced himself to step back. He nodded slowly, which might have been the bravest thing he'd done. "Okay," he said. Then, while she turned away to breathe, he sent a discreet message to his head of security. "Respect her battle. Don't leave her unguarded." Thomas Carter did not go home to think about life choices. He went to the tabloids with the story he thought would sell. Heartless billionaire Damien Hart brainwashes girlfriend, turns her against ailing father. The article painted Damien as a manipulator and Lila as a naive gold digger. A narrative so clean in its ugliness, it would have been hilarious if it didn't land on her chest like a weight. The stock ticker at the bottom of a news channel crawled down, red. Anchors made speculation look like fact. Lila watched it and felt the terrible dawning of responsibility. Not for what her father had done, but for what was happening to Damien because of proximity to her ghosts. Maybe Jared had been right. Maybe Celeste had been right. Maybe she didn't belong. She called Damien at 3 in the morning, the hour when truth gets stripped and you either lie to yourself or you don't. He answered on the second ring, his voice freighted and quiet. "You're going to end this," he said, not accusing, just tired and expecting the blow. "No," she said, and it came out as a choke, her throat tight with terror. "I'm asking if it's worth all this. Look what I'm doing to you, To Heart and Company, I'm ruining your life." Silence opened, wide and deep. She imagined him on his terrace, the city spilling under his feet, the air cold. "Stay where you are," he said finally, voice rough. "I'm coming." 20 minutes later, they stood on the rooftop with the city glittering like something holy and indifferent below. "Is there pressure?" he said, answering the question she couldn't ask. "Yes. The board is breathing down every neck I have. Investors are nervous. PR is cracked out on caffeine." He turned to her, the line of his mouth fierce. "But if you're asking if it's worth it, the answer is yes. 1,000 times yes." He framed her face with his hands like he was placing something fragile somewhere it would be safe. "You are the only real thing in my life, Lila. Everything else is just noise." She fell into him and let the ugly part of the world slip away, if only for a minute. They decided to fight. He wanted to handle it the way he handled all disasters, with the best lawyers money could buy and a PR team that spoke spin like it was a first language. She insisted on telling her own story. "I can't let them decide who I am," she said. "I won't be a victim in my father's narrative or a villain in theirs." She agreed to a single televised interview with a journalist who didn't do gossip, who had made politicians and CEOs cry. Under studio lights that made her skin feel too thin, she told the truth. She spoke of the father who had left, the mother who had worked 2 jobs and still sang while stirring sauce on Sundays, the man who had appeared only when he smelled money. She didn't cry on camera. She didn't perform pain. She was poised, honest, human. The interview went viral. As always, the worst parts of the internet rose like bubbles to the top of a glass and popped without anyone noticing until everything tasted sour. Trolls called her a calculated actress. The word gold digger got attached to her name like a suffix. Anonymous hate slithered into her DMs, then into her inbox. Then someone found the school's phone number, and the poison started leaking into her day job. The breaking point was a small package and an old symbol made ugly. The principal, face pale, voice shaking, met her at the door. "A package came for you. We called the police." Inside, cushioned by tissue paper that had once been lemon bright, was a single dead sunflower, black petals curled. The ugliness of it made her chest ache. That night, she packed a bag. Pride in independence turned foolish in the face of a threat that slithered out of the dark corners of the internet and into her actual life. She moved into the penthouse not as a guest or a girlfriend, but as someone seeking shelter from a storm with teeth. It worked for exactly as long as anything held together under that much pressure. The fight pawned itself off as dinner plans, and then flipped the board just to watch the pieces scatter. When Damien called to cancel yet another evening because a PR fire had flared, something inside Lila snapped. "I can't do this anymore," she shouted into rooms with a view in which her life looked very small. He came home to her rage and his regret meeting each other like 2 people in a hallway who didn't know who should go first. "Victoria Celeste was right," Lila yelled, using an old enemy's name as a weapon against him, and instantly wanting to take the words back. "You're married to your work. You'll promise, but you won't be here." "That's not fair," he said quietly, and the pain on his face hurt more than any yelling could have. She couldn't stop. "Is any of this fair? I can't go to work. I can't see my friends. I am a prisoner in your palace, and the only part of this I was looking forward to was seeing you. And you're never here. You think this is easy for me?" He shot back, control shredding. "I have 10,000 employees whose lives depend on stability that's imploding. I can't just drop everything because—" He stopped. "I'm not asking you to drop everything," she said, tears hot and merciless. "I'm asking you to choose me for 5 minutes. To make me a priority once." They threw words like stones. They weren't fighting about pasta or cancellations. They were fighting about fear and class and the brutal way that love peels excuses off your life. Finally, breath ragged, Damien grabbed his keys. "I need air," he said, and the door closing sounded exactly like a line breaking. She curled on the couch and punished herself with the echo. Hours later, her phone lit with a number she didn't recognize. "Lila, my name is Marianne Hart," the voice on the other end said, elegant and fragile, threaded with remorse. "I am Damien's mother." Lila sat up so fast the room tilted. "He told me," he said. "I know." The sigh was heavy enough to bend air. "It is easier to say I'm gone than to tell the truth. When my husband died, I fell apart. I couldn't watch my son try to hold the world together with his bare hands. So I left. I am a coward. I have watched from a distance since. He loves you more than he has loved anyone since his father. Please don't let him drown himself again. He works because work never leaves. You are the first person who has made him want to live." Damien returned, pale and scraped raw. Lila didn't yell. "I spoke to your mother," she said, and the sentence undid him. He collapsed on the sofa, face in his hands, a sob rupturing out of him so deep and old that it made the room feel like a church. He told her everything he hadn't said, the way grief had stripped him, the betrayal of being abandoned by the parent who should have stayed, the way he had used work as anesthesia until he couldn't feel anything but numbers. "I'm so afraid of losing you," he whispered, tears cutting tracks into skin that had forgotten what crying was for. "I'm so scared I'll mess this up that I'm doing it right now." She moved to gather him up. Before her arms could do the work, his phone buzzed violently. He looked. The color drained. "There's been an accident," he said in a voice that had already gone somewhere else, somewhere under fluorescent lights and screaming sirens. "Structural collapse at the Riverbend processing plant. People are hurt. I have to go." He stood in automatic CEO armor, and his hands shook as he tried to fasten buckles that weren't there. The world asked him to leave the hardest thing and fix the thing he knew how to fix. Lila had a choice: stay high and safe, or follow him into whatever waited. As the elevator doors kissed open, she slid her hand into his. He looked down at it, startled. "I'm coming with you." "Lila, no," he said, voice strained to breaking. "It will be chaos. It could be dangerous. This is my responsibility." "This is what people who love each other do," she said, her hand an anchor. "They show up." "So, I'm showing up." He gripped her hand like a drowning man clinging to a rope and breathed for the first time since the phone had gone off. The Riverbend plant was a mess of flashing red and blue, scaffolding crumpled like discarded foil, the metallic tang of blood undercut by the acrid stink of burnt wiring. Workers huddled in clumps around foremen. EMTs moved with ballet precision. Damien shed his jacket and waded into the center of the chaos like the eye of a storm, barking orders that didn't sound like barks because they were threaded with names and empathy. "Marisol, your crew accounted for? Ramon, where's your brother?" He crouched to speak to a teen holding his father's hand. "I've got the best doctors standing by. We'll take care of him." He wasn't a CEO. He was a man who had decided no one who worked for him would ever be a number in a report. Watching him move heaven and earth for his people made Lila's love reconfigure itself into something bigger. His work wasn't an enemy, it was his mission. It was the thing that made him who he was, the thing she loved. The preliminary investigation came back with a word that made everyone's stomach drop: sabotage. Someone had tampered with supports. It looked like a competitor or a vengeful ex-executive. A week later, security footage proved uglier. A man took a briefcase full of cash, walked into the plant after hours, and did what someone had paid him to do. Thomas Carter. The news blurred in front of Lila, guilt-flooded, heavy and immediate. "This is my fault," she said that night. As if the words could be the penance. "All of it. Because of me." "No," Damien said fiercely into her hair. "Never say that. You are not responsible for his choices. You are responsible for yours." He pulled back and looked at her, and certainty sat calmly in his eyes, like it didn't have to prove it belonged there. "And you chose to stand in the middle of a factory collapse with me." Thomas was arrested. The sordid little story of espionage and betrayal spilled into headlines that finally told the right story. Public opinion swung like a pendulum that for once did not hit them on its return swing. Sympathy replaced suspicion. But victory tasted like ash. The wound of family is not healed by a judge, it scars. Damien cleared his calendar for the first time in 8 years and showed up at Lila's side with nothing to sell and no empire to run for a minute. He found her staring at the city as if counting lights were an incantation. "Run away with me," he said softly, "for a little while. Somewhere no one knows our names. No press, no ghosts." She turned. "You can do that? I need to prove to you, and to myself, that I know how to choose you. Not next quarter, now." Tears filled her eyes. It was the most expensive thing he could have offered. "Yes," she whispered, and then added, because in order to leave clean she had to cut one last thread. "But there's something I need to do first." The county jail visitors' room smelled like antiseptic and stale coffee, a place where remorse looked like performative humility through glass. Lila sat on a hard plastic chair and waited. Thomas shuffled in on the other side, looking less like a villain and more like a man whose worst choices had finally landed on him. He picked up the receiver, hands trembling. He apologized, or tried to anyway. He blamed debt. He blamed the rival corporation that had bought him. He blamed a bad childhood and bad luck and the weather for all the responsibility he avoided. Lila listened. Sometimes indignation is a flame. Sometimes it's a lake that puts fires out. When he ran out of words, she didn't reach for rage. "I forgive you," she said. Hope flashed across his face like a wrong reflection. "Not because you deserve it," she added gently, "because I deserve peace. I have let the ghost of the father you could have been haunt every room. I am done. You don't have that power anymore." She stood. "This is the last time we will ever speak." "Wait," he called, voice mending itself briefly with a shred of honest fear. Do you really love him?" She looked back at him, a stranger who shared her eyes and nothing else. "Only in biology," she said with a small, real smile. "And yes, more than you could understand." She walked out feeling weightless where she had been carrying iron. Her phone buzzed with a number she didn't know. It was Celeste. "I don't expect you to forgive me," Celeste said at a coffee shop down the street, stirring a cup she didn't drink. She was smaller without the armor of her title. "I was in love with him. Or with an idea of him. I thought if I stood close enough, it would make me enough." She looked up and there was sincerity where there had only been shine. "At the gallery, the night of the scene," her lip twitched at the memory. "I saw the way he looked at you. He never looked at me like that." She swallowed. "What you have is real. I hope you'll be happy." It wasn't an apology so much as a surrender, and Lila accepted it as the kind of closure that is offered, not demanded. Back at the penthouse, Damien had bags packed by the door. She told him both conversations about the forgiveness that had nothing to do with him and the blessing from a woman who had once tried to pry them apart. He looked at her with pride so bright it was almost hard to hold. The next day, they stood on the tarmac at a private airfield as a jet waited with casual patience. The sky was the clean blue of a fresh start. Damien fidgeted with his watch in a way that didn't belong to him. Lila took his hand. "You okay?" "Perfect," he said, and smiled. And the tremor underneath told her the trip was not just a trip. Provence stretched out in gold and green, lavender fields humming, cypress trees throwing shadows like sundials. For 2 weeks they weren't a CEO and a scandal survivor with a teaching license. They were people in love. They got lost on purpose. They drank wine that tasted like sunshine, with farmers whose hands were maps. They listened to a violinist in a square play La Vie en Rose while old couples danced. He discovered the joy of biting into a warm apricot and letting juice run down his hand. She discovered the quiet luxury of waking up next to a face that looked unburdened. He saw the world through her habit of attention, the way she paused at a wrought iron gate's intricate pattern, the way her eyes went wide at a wildflower growing out of stone. She saw the man behind Hart & Company, playful and easy when he put down the weight he carried. On their last night, Damien took her to a family-run trattoria on a hill, because he still insisted on Italian, even in France. They sat on a terrace as the valley below glowed, acres of sunflowers turning their faces like prayers to a sun dipping low. "I could live like this forever," Lila sighed, cheek on his shoulder, watching colors spill like paint. "Then let's do that," he answered softly, and she lifted her head at the seriousness beneath the softness. After dinner, he led her by the hand to an overlook where the whole world looked like a painting. He stopped and let out a breath that tried to steady him and failed. "I wrote a speech," he admitted with a laugh that was half fear. "I practiced it in the mirror. But now you're here and all I can think is, my life was black and white before I met you." He took both her hands in his. "You brought color, Lila. You brought poetry and messy food trucks and a purpose beyond boardrooms. You showed me what home feels like. You loved me, not a company, not a name." He went down on one knee, and her body learned a new way to shake. He opened a small velvet box. The ring inside was vintage-inspired and so perfectly, exactly her, that it took her a second to realize why. The delicate band matched a sketch she'd once drawn in the margin of a notebook when she was bored at a meeting that was not for her. He remembered. "I know this was fast," he said, voice thick with tears. "I know our path here was a screenplay with too many twists. But I know, so deeply I can't explain it, that I want to spend every day of my life trying to be the man you deserve. Lila Carter, you make me want to be better. You make me believe in happiness. Will you marry me?" She nodded before she could speak, tears falling. "Yes," she managed, laughing and crying, and saying it again because once didn't hold enough joy. "Yes, yes, yes." He slid the ring on. It fit like it had known her finger for years. When he stood and kissed her, a small group of locals applauded politely, because there are languages you don't need to share to understand. 6 months later, the wedding was not the gala event Page 6 whispered about. It was held in the sun-dappled garden of a small, historic estate in New Harbor. String lights woven through trees, tables set like someone had thought about how plates looked next to flowers. Her mother cried like someone who had been waiting to set the last heavy bag down. On the other side of the aisle, Marianne Hart sat trembling and hopeful. And when Damien hugged her after the vows, their tears baptized something old. Later, as music floated and the sun slid away, Lila stood still in the middle of warmth and laughter just to feel what her life felt like. Damien's arms wrapped around her waist, anchoring her. "What are you thinking about, Mrs. Hart?" he murmured into her hair. She would keep her own name for her writing, but she liked the sound of his in contexts like this. She turned to face him, heart so full it felt like pressure. "I was thinking about Aveline," she said with a smile, "about how I thought my life had ended at a table for two, and how that was really just the moment the story got good." She cupped his face in both hands and kissed him like she was still in a lavender field under a French sky. "Sometimes," she said against his mouth, "you have to be left to be found." He smiled that slow smile that had collected her from a room of pitying eyes and changed her life. They danced under the stars, two people who had found each other in the ruins of a canceled dinner, the glare of an art opening, a factory collapse, and the bright violence of public opinion. The music drifted, and for the first time in their beautifully complicated lives, both of them were exactly and completely home.